We've all heard the news. President Joe Biden has announced that COVID-19 vaccines will be mandated for large employers and federal workers. What this means for the cleaning industry, facilities, and companies is yet to be completely understood. But to get a head start on this upcoming challenge, we have with us John Nothdurft, the ISSA Director of Government Affairs. John and his team are keeping an eye on these developments as they come out, and he has a few comments for us today. So, John, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Jeff.
So, when you first heard this news, what was your first thought? After you picked yourself up off the ground.
Well, I don't think it was, it was somewhat surprising. I think the scope of the proposal, but I think we could kind of all see the writing on the wall that this was the path or that we were moving in the direction of some sort of mandatory vaccination. I think it's kind of the interesting thing is trying to unpack some of the details, right? The fact that they're using federal OSHA as the major kind of regulatory agency of which they're going to try to implement this law. So it's kind of interesting. You have a couple different pieces. You have OSHA, which is in the Department of Labor, implementing the, if you're an employer of more than 100 workers, they're going to be in the enforcement agency. So they have to write a temporary emergency standard. Then if you're a healthcare agency, you're actually being run by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid. So basically, that's their enforcement agency there. And then obviously they already have oversight over federal workers. So it's kind of interesting the way that they're kind of using different levers to try to enforce some sort of vaccine mandate on a broad swath of the economy as well as the workplace.
Mm-hmm. So how challenging do you think it'll be for the cleaning industry to comply? And I ask that question because it seems like just monitoring who's vaccinated and who's not, and the weekly tests that'll be required, who does that fall on? So what do you think?
Yeah, so specifically, I think the broad swath, about 80 million employees are under this OSHA, basically the private sector vaccine mandate. So we'll kind of focus there just because I think that's the one most people have questions about. And it is unique because it's the only one of the three I mentioned. So that actually has an exemption for basically you can test out, right? You can weekly test out of getting a vaccine. I think it's really kind of up to employers, right? I mean, they are kind of putting this back on employers saying you can, if you would like to, you can implement some sort of strong testing platform. But I think to your point, I think a lot of employers are going to kind of say, well, what's the pros and cons of that? Is this just too much to try to deal with? But also weighing, we have to also understand that it's a very tight labor market. And, there's been research saying about a quarter of workers have said they would potentially quit their job over a vaccine mandate. So I think you have large, small, or medium-sized employers trying to figure out, okay, how likely am I going to lose workers? How easy is it going to replace them? Do I need to implement a testing mandate, or do I just go full bore and say, we're going to go only vaccine mandate, it's the only way, and what that looks like. So I think there's a lot of questions for employers. And I don't think there's a one size fits all model, but to your point, there is some very complicated questions that are not easy questions to answer.
Yeah, I know we'll get more information as this continues to develop. What caught my eye in this news was the violations. What I read is $14,000 each violation.
Yeah,
that's a significant fine. What do you know about these violations? Does that mean like a couple of warnings first and then bam, you owe $14,000?
So we really don't know, right? So the OSHA, which is, once I mentioned, part of Department of Labor, they have to write these rules. It's going to take them a couple of weeks. And then even beyond that, the numbers that are being thrown around is either 75 days or 90 days to come into compliance. So even if there are any types of actual fines, we're not talking for another 3 months that these would even be able to be enforced. So what does COVID look like at that point? And you mentioned kind of it's actually up to 14,000. So are there lesser ones? Are there lesser penalties? Is it per employee that doesn't? We just don't know. So I think it's going to be a lot of wait and see to figure out what that looks like. I will say, though, and we've seen this during COVID, the Biden administration has invested quite a bit more significant resources in enforcement for OSHA laws and regulations. So they have beefed up their staff to enforce these types of regulations. So it'll be interesting to see. So they do have more ability to enforce it than they did even 6 months ago.
Yeah, you're right. Who knows what'll happen in 3 months? We'll just have to see. John, this mandate is obviously just for United States companies. But what if you have foreign-based employees and that puts you over the 100 mark? Is that?
So my assumption would be, and this is, you shouldn't make assumptions, but a lot of multinational corporations or companies that are foreign-based probably are large enough to have more than 100 employees in the United States. That's just my guess. So I think we're talking about a fairly small group of employers that could actually fall underneath that. But once again, that's going to come up to how the regulations are written. I will say, though, if they're a federal contractor, so let's say they're cleaning federal buildings, well, that's not going to even matter because they're already, there is no limit for how large or small you are if you have a federal contract. Same with healthcare facilities. There's not that exemption for those smaller companies. So we're really only talking about that one thing about 100 employees or more. My assumption it would count those employees, but that would be an assumption.
Okay, maybe that's not a good question. You're good points. What about subcontractors? Now, I'm asking that question because a lot of building service contractors might use subs, or construction companies might use sub workers. Does that play into this?
I hate to be like a broken record, but I do think this is one of those instances that we're going to have to wait and see. We just don't know. It's tough to differentiate that. We do have different laws that mandate or cover subcontractors versus direct employees. Now, I will say the Biden administration, since they've taken office, have tried to eliminate some of the ways that employers hire subcontractors, because they do want to make sure that they're getting all the benefits and are operating at, above board as kind of employees, rather than just saying they're a subcontractor to get around some of these regulations. So my assumption would be they're probably going to try to be as tight as possible on implementing some of these mandates. So I don't think there's going to be much wiggle room. So if you do employ a lot of subcontractors, it'll be kind of wait and see. But I do think that's going to play into these regulations that come down in the next couple of months.
Yeah. Well, John, even if you don't have all the information, you've got good stuff there. So appreciate the advice, the information. But let me toss this one at you. What about remote workers?
Yeah, once again, I think that's going to be the interesting thing. I will say, I think remote workers are the one place. I don't think there's going to be a differentiation. I just don't. I mean, if you've seen any of the other things that are out there, I would say that's the less likely of the three occurrences that you mentioned that will get some sort of exemption.
I was thinking that as well, because they can come into the office and that's the point. Yeah.
A lot of places have hybrid workforces now. I don't think that's, and there's really not this sort of like written regulation over, work from home or permanent home remote workers. So I don't think that's really going to be as an issue. So I don't think those will be exempted.
Mm-hmm. Any thoughts on pushback? Obviously, there's a lot of talk and a lot of upset people. Do you see any movement there?
Well, I think you have two fronts, right? We are already seeing pushback in predominantly Republican states by Republican governors that are likely to bring some type of lawsuits. And we do have quite a bit of time. Like I said, these are at minimum aren't going to take place or be in effect for another 3 months. So there is time for kind of the legal system to kind of work through some of these court cases. But then even internally on a micro level, as a company, you're going to have to deal with this, right? You're going to have to deal with the employers who are pro-vaccine mandate, those who are anti-vaccine mandate, and then kind of those in between. So what does this look like? We really don't know. Now, there was some recent polling done about these specific cases, and it's about 58% of the voting population that says they're supportive of a vaccine mandate in the way that has been applied. So that means 42% of the average workforce is probably still going to be against these. So I think every company has to look into this themselves, try to figure out what's the best for their employees and themselves. And kind of look through there. But I think there is going to be pushback. There's going to be legal pushback, and there's going to be a pushback on both sides within a workforce. And then also customers. which is also some of the thing that I've heard from a lot of our members, especially those in the business service or residential cleaning market, who have clients who are saying, we only want vaccinated people coming into our buildings to clean. So that's kind of the third part, right? You also have the customers that are also weighing in on these. So it's a very complicated issue that I think there's going to be a lot of pushback on all sides of the issue.
Mm-hmm. So does this type of action move us closer to perhaps required vaccine passports, the proof you've gotten your vaccine?
Well, I think if you see that, it's obviously the biggest, what I hear at least from folks in Washington, D.C. and some of those types of, the people who would be making these decisions. I think if they go in any direction, it's going to be a true travel one. So maybe something for flying, crossing borders, those types of things. I don't know. I think there's still a lot of pushback about that. I don't think that's as supported, I guess, mainstream yet. Not to say that it can't get there, but I think at this point, that might be a little too much to chew for the administration. That's just me kind of talking more from a political sense than if I think it's a good idea or not. And I think that's something to wait and see. I do think if this gets worse and the COVID-19 gets worse and maybe vaccines aren't still, even the mandates aren't working, I could see that as being the next step. But I don't think we're quite there yet. I could see individual companies doing that, whether it's, the airline industry, cruise industry, those types of things. But that'll be interesting to watch.